Loudmouth George and the Fishing Trip by Nancy Carlson. George was always bragging. According to him, he ran the fastest. And he ate the biggest pizzas. And he read the thickest books. So when Harriet told him she was going fishing on Saturday, of course George bragged that he caught the biggest fish. "If you're such a good fisherman," said Harriet, "why don't you come with us?" "I'd better not," said George. I'd probably catch such a big fish, it would sink the boat." Harriet didn't believe him for a minute. When she got home, she asked her dad if George could come with them on Saturday. "Sure," said Dad. "I'll give his parents a call." "Guess what, George?" said George's mother. "Harriet's father just called and invited you on a fishing trip tomorrow. Won't that be fun?" "Oh no," thought George. "Why did I brag so much? The biggest fish I ever caught was in the pet shop." Early next morning, they were off to the road. "George, I brought an extra fishing rod if you need it," said Harriet's mother. "As a matter of fact, I do. You see, the last time I went fishing, I hooked this enormous fish. It was so big, it broke my fishing rod," George bragged. At last, they were out on the water. "Here's a worm for your hook, George," said Harriet. "I thought you'd fished before," said Harriet. "Well, I have," George fibbed, "but we don't use worms. We used other stuff." So Harriet baited George's hook. Then they sat, and they sat, and they sat. They sat for 3 hours, and no one got even a nibble. "I think we'll call it a day," said Harriet's father. "The fish just aren't biting today." Thank heaven, thought George, as he started to reel in his line. Suddenly his bobber went down. "You got a fish, George!" yelled Harriet. "Oh, wow," said George. "Well, what do I do?" "I thought you were a great fisherman," said Harriet. I guess I exaggerated a little bit," George confessed. "Help me!" "Keep reeling it in, George," Harriet told him. "It's the biggest fish ever," yelled George. "You've almost got it, George," said Harriet. "Just keep reeling it." "It's so big it will bite my hand off," yelled George. "Here it comes," said Harriet. "Oops," said George. "Better throw it back, George," said Harriet. "It's too little to keep." "Well, it felt big," said George. Monday after school, George told Ralph all about the fishing trip. "I caught a fish, and it was this big," he said. "How big, George?" said Harriet. "Well, this big," said George. "How big?" "Well, maybe it was only this big," said George. "But it sure put up a big fight." The end.